Hello, dear friends. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on when you're watching us. Have a good rest of your day. I'm Daniel Kamrov, and this is my podcast. We continue our meetings and conversations with outstanding religious leaders, scientists, and ordinary people. Nowadays, religions continue to play their role in various conflicts and wars. Understanding that there are different paths to God, to one's temple, our goal is to discuss how to build bridges of mutual assistance and peace building between religions. I'm asked who the target audience of the podcast is. I believe that in every religion there are those who are ready to understand others, sharing with them the desire and value of living in peace, and my podcast is addressed primarily to them. Today, we meet with Michal Bar-Asher Siegal. Michal is a professor and vice president for global engagement at Ben Gurion University, Israel. She is a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. Her work focuses on aspects of Jewish-Christian interactions in the ancient world and compares early Christian and rabbinic sources. Dear Professor Michal, thank you for the wonderful opportunity to learn from you.
Thank you for having me.
I heard that you love Agatha Christie's books. So let's start our conversation with her quote. There is a saying that one should speak well of the dead or not at all. I think that is nonsense. The truth is always the truth. If it comes to that, one should restrain oneself when speaking of the living. They can be offended, unlike the dead. End of quote. How did it happen that you are fascinated by literary sources, thoughts, ideas, and polemics of people who have long been in a better world? Could you please give an example, a story? Why is this a fascinating subject for research?
That's a very good question to start with. First of all, I agree with you. I think we should look at history critically and we should examine their strengths and weaknesses. We should also acknowledge the fact that things come in context, meaning, what happened 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, sayings, let's say, male chauvinistic sayings that were said then and now should be viewed differently, right? We should always understand the background and the context in which things were said. Having said that, I agree with you. I think that things should be looked at critically, and we should, study things in relation to our lives. Even when I do, critical religion, study of religion. When it comes to my profession, I study Jewish culture and Jewish texts and rabbinic texts. My problem is these texts are not dead texts. They're not, people who lived. Winston Churchill or Agatha Christie were reading what they said and they're dead. No, here, the things that people said, 1,500 years ago, 1,700 years ago, has direct ramification of my life here in Israel or Jews across the world. Because these texts, and especially the text that I study, which is called the Babylonian Talmud, texts that contain tradition going back to the 1st century CE, all the way to the 7th century, but was about the 11th century, became the most important critical text. These tradition affect the way Jews live around the world and the way the state of Israel runs marriage, burial, divorce, even bank issues, social security payment. So we are actually living in a country where those laws, those religion law have effect on people's lives. So when I say I read those texts and I'm critical or not critical of them, that has a significance to what people are actually doing in their lives. Now, it means that, first of all, I will, as a scientist, as a critical reader of those texts, I might encounter opposition from people who disagree with stuff that I say. They will also influence, and they did influence the way scholars study those texts. So from the 19th century, when the critical study of religion began, scholars were influenced by their background with the question they asked. So a very good example of that is my field of study. So I study those texts in comparison to Christian texts of the time. And that hasn't been done before. The question is the Babylonian Talmud influence or has connection with Christian text was not a question asked. And the reason that it wasn't asked is because both scholars from the Christian sides and from the Jewish sides were influenced by their beliefs, their sets of beliefs. So, for example, Christian scholars in the 19th century, etc., looked down on Eastern Christianity. They thought it was minor, and every Ivy League has a Greek and Latin, department, classics department, but almost none. You can really count on one hand the university that offers Syriac, which is the language, the Aramaic, in which Eastern Christianity operated on. They looked down on this, so it wasn't studied. And because it wasn't studies, when I come to compare my sources, which were redacted in Palestine and in modern day Iran and Iraq, that geographical area that was surrounded by Eastern Christianity, I didn't have in the 19th century, early 20th century, I didn't have sources because scholars didn't study those texts. So you see how the lack of, awareness of your background and your belief and the system that influenced the question you ask. And on the Jewish side, scholars who studied Talmud were mostly religious Jews, men from Western Europe, who didn't want to look at Jewish-Christian relations because they believed that Talmud was a sacred text governed by God. And they were very comfortable by saying it has nothing to do with Christians, so we don't even need to ask that question. So it was nice not having the Christian side to disprove that, but they lived very comfortably with that notion and didn't ask those questions. So when you say, how do we treat our past? How do we treat dead people? My dead people are still around. They're very much influencing my life. So they're influencing life in the way people are behaving. They're influencing life in the way people react to my findings. Because, for example, I find that the Talmud was very much engaged with Christian views and opinions. So that might anger people and also influence the history of the literature. And lastly, when we talk about, dead people and how it influenced our life, etc., we have to admit that, when you also asked me, why do I like this text? I like this text, even though often they're very male chauvinistic or racist, or, they're very, specific, very male, very, all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't want to be friends with those people if I meet them today, right? But they're also very much mine. They're my tradition. They're my, these are, first of all, they're very funny, and they're not always intending to be that, but they're very full of life and full of complexity and very human. And they're my tradition. This is, two sides of the coin that my entire tradition, my life here in Israel, my life as a Jew, my life as a woman is in my family, my ancestry. This all comes from those texts. So studying them feels a little bit like home. Because they're mine. It's not like studying, when I read Christian text, or they don't feel the same way. So I have to admit, this was my journey. And lastly, you have to remember, I grew up religious. I grew up in a religious girls' school, which didn't teach those sources. Women were not allowed to study Talmud, so I wasn't allowed. The first time I laid hand or looked at a Talmud page was when I was 19, that late. And I looked at those texts and almost immediately fell in love. It felt for the first time that I'm getting direct access to sources that influence my life without anyone being some kind of I'm missing the English word for that, but someone to tell me what the texts say. I didn't have any mediators like that. That's the word I was looking for. I had direct access to this text, and they were much more complex and much more interesting to look at. So I got to it very late, but fell in love instantly with it. And I think because, it was mine, but not mine, and it was much more complex and beautiful. And actually, on a ironic side, made me like my religion much more, or my tradition much more than before. So that's a very long answer to your question.
That's a great answer. And the follow-up to that, do you think that it is more interesting, I guess is the word, to study Talmud and those texts living in Israel, where some of the laws are based on those texts? Does it bring you closer to the texts and understanding those texts?
I think if you would have asked me that 5 years ago, I would have given a different answer than now. I think now we're in a situation in Israel where religion is right in the top and center of a very, very I don't know, very emotional disagreement and a very emotional battle over how the state of Israel is going to look like in the next decade and the next, I don't know, century if we manage to keep this country alive. And Judaism is right smack in the middle. And that's an argument we'll have to decide upon as a country, as a state. And here I am less charitable to my sources. And I kept telling all my friends, and I said, you'll see. You'll need me as a Talmudist as much more than you'll need any other profession in the next years because I'll tell you what those laws, the religious laws that are trying to pass mean. So where everything that has to do with war ethics, our rights on this land, how to treat non-Jews, how to treat women, what to do with kidnapped people, what's our obligation towards our kin, what are the priorities we do. All of this is informed by our government's background and belief, and even who needs to go, what's the place of the study of the Torah versus the place of, serving in the army. All of this is centered around my tech. I have the most important profession in Israel. I am not even kidding. It's like you have to be informed to understand this conversation, to understand where it's coming from. I'll give you an example. I live in a city called Jerusalem in Israel, and in my city, it's nearly impossible to show women on billboards because Haredi ultra-Orthodox people, take the signs down. The people who publishes things or do the publicity or use those billboards don't want to, it costs money every time they put something up, they destroy it. So they stopped putting women on billboards. So I actually live in a city where women are not allowed to show their faces, in the public sphere. Speak in public, sing in public in certain events. There is entire events funded by the city hall that is without women because some section of the population don't want to see women. Now, this is based on laws that were taught and thought by men 1500 years ago, which was, everyone thought that way about women back then. We don't think like that in our regular life, supposedly, but now we're forced to consider or negotiate with people what they say. And this is something that has really intensified in the last government, and the legitimacy of it has intensified. And this is something that Israel will have to decide what kind of a country you want to. I can't believe I have to stipulate that, but we live in a country where in 2025, there are entire segment of parties in the government who don't allow women to run for parliament. And that's legal in the state of Israel. Women are not allowed in the ultra-Orthodox, parties to be elected. This is something that is directly governed by saying of men that spoke in the Talmud 1500 years ago. So, but again, we've normalized some of this stuff, and by the way, it's okay to reach a conclusion that this is how we want to treat women. We have Muslim countries around us that reach similar conclusion about women's presence in public sphere. This is legitimate, I guess, to reach that conclusion. But the problem is, I think the vast majority of Israelis don't want to go there, but they don't know, we kind of normalize the fact that we have to, be considerate of certain population and don't understand the prices we pay. So as a woman, this is something that is very close to my heart. I have to say, even in segment of the population that is academic, I wrote my dissertation at Yale, and then I did a postdoc at Harvard, and then came back to teach in Israel and Talmud. When I came, I doubled the number of female professors in Talmud that deal in academia in Israel that deals with Talmud. So you were sitting for 10 years with 50% of Talmud female Talmudists in Israel. There was just one, and then I joined it. And now we have three and a half. So we're very happy about the growth of people who are, but the numbers are very, very small. I always said there is no line in the bathroom in Talmudist country, conferences when I come to teach because, there are no women in conferences. And this is not the case in the US recently, where many women in recent, decade, I would say, have joined our ranks, and it's nice. Israel has still a lot to progress in that arena, and I think we're doing much better now. But in any case, this is something that influences also the way the academic world looks. I think we can't ignore the connection between me being a woman and the sort of questions and being trained in the US, and my advisor is a non-Jewish female who's an amazing scholar, and the question I ask and she asks are different than the question than the previous scholars have asked. So these things are connected and tied in, not only in the general public, but also in the academic circles in which I teach.
Is the Talmud about men and for men? I guess would be the main question.
Yes, the answer is yes. So it's a good question. How much can we? It's a methodological question. This text was written by men for men, that we know. The question is, can we sense the presence of women in this text? And that's a greater methodological question. What do we do? By the way, we're not unique, right? The Talmud is not unique in the world of late antiquity and early medieval time, where men were the one, who wrote the text, the religious text for sure, and the scientific text, and their audiences were men. And the question is, can we still attempt to hear female voices from those texts? And that's a methodological question that's dealt a lot in sociology and anthropology. There's a very famous article called "Can the these quiet voices can be heard? Can we hear them?" Giatri Spivak, for example, wrote it. Homi Baba was discussing, a lot of post-colonial scholars who were dealing with it in 19th century texts about, Indian under British occupation. Can we recuperate from, sort of British anthropologists and sociologists were describing India? And the question is, can we from that really understand what the Indian people who they controlled actually felt? And even when they're interviewing them, but they're bringing their voice, can we still hear them? It's a question. It's a question. Can we do that or not? And can we do that with Talmudic text? So the Talmud does quote from time to time women. They say, I have a PhD student who just submitted her PhD on sayings my a mom who talks about. We have a bunch of sayings my moms who speak about medicine, etc. So that's a few of those. We have a few female characters, very few. Boria and Ima Shalom. We have a few people who are Yalta, who are mentioned by name. So we have very, very few. There are, minimal female that are quoted. They're the exception. But the question is, when, for example, we have an entire tractate that deals with the menstrual period of women, did they have sources that they talked to women, for example, and this is how they knew how it felt? I just read this one of the paragraphs about how women feel when they're being raped, and so there's a few description. How do they know, right? They're not women. So who were they speaking to? How did they get their information? Is this information reliable enough for us to learn actually about women's experiences in the ancient world? So all of these are interesting questions. When they talk about baking and when they talk about, cooking, who are they talking to? I'm guessing their wives or their sisters or their mothers. And so how is this, and especially in medicine or in magic, all kinds of areas that we know the women operated, how much can we learn from that? But at the end of the day, even if we have women voices, these are texts that are transmitted by men, for men, by men, in the language of men. And that's something that we need to, to remember when we read this text. And that's Not hard to remember because the text really, symbolize, really project. One of my favorite texts that I teach in class because it talks about Jesus, which is a part of what I do. So the Talmud asks a question. It says there's a verse in the Bible that says, "May evil not befall you." So the Talmud asks, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? Well, what is evil? When you wish someone may evil not befall you, what do you mean? So let's stop here for a second, Daniel. Think about it. When you say when evil not befall you, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? And I think this question, after October 7th, and gets a very, very real, answer. But think about it for a second. I'm not going to ask you your answer, but think about what you would have answered. I know what I would have answered, right? And if something happened to my kids or my husband, my parents, right? This is something that is very real to me. Everyone with their answer. Now you see what the answers that the rabbis give. So one of the answer is may your student not turn into Jesus. So that's this is why example. But one of the answers, which I find hilarious and very, very funny, is that one of the rabbis say that you travel on a business trip for a very long time. You're away from home for a long time, and then you come back and you find your wife menstrually impure, so you have to wait to have sex with her. And I'm like, you read this and you're like, this is what the worst thing he could have imagined. When he imagined the worst thing, this is what he chose to say. So it's such a male text, right? That deals with business, travel and how hard it is and how miserable he is when he comes back and his wife. So this is such a male perspective on a question that you can't, not, this is such a text that is full of this kind of testosterone and male point of view. But by the way, I have to say also a very honest text. The rabbis are very honest. They present themselves in all their humanities and the failing of humans, and they're very about their what they're stressed about and what their fears and they're very honest about this. So this is also before social media, it was very hard for me to explain what the Talmud is, but ever since we have social media, it's hard. It's easier for me. The Talmud is kind of like Instagram or Twitter account where you have quotes, short quotes or a story or something, and then people react to it. We have rabbis reacting to it, and sometimes there's like quotes of what the original saying is, or paraphrases of that, and then people react and say, "No, this is completely wrong." "Oh, yes, we agree," and it's a noisy text with a lot of tradition. This is really, and we have a snapshot of that reality, which is kind of cool. You get kind of like someone quoting from Churchill, and then like someone says, "No, you're misquoting him. He actually said something else." And then this is it. Like a rabbi says something, and someone say, "No, you didn't quote the rabbi properly. This is what he says, and it's completely wrong, and it only applies in this case." And there's a community note like we do in Twitter, and saying, "No, this is not." All of this and our redaction of the text. So this is the Talmud is like that. But the coolest thing, this goes back to like 1700 years ago, 1500 years ago, and you can actually get a sense of that, including female voices in it, but it's a very, very male text at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer. I wouldn't understand or compare it to Twitter. I just didn't think of that. That is a very unique, I guess, way of looking at it. And my next question is in your books, you say that rabbinic Judaism and the Christian texts of the same time rely on the same source, Tanakh, the Bible. Jews and Christians live side by side. Can you give an example, a story from the Talmud that would illustrate the influence of Christian neighbors' uh, ideas on Jews?
Yeah. So first of all, I have to say in the context of what we're talking, this is and especially since you're interested in inter-religious dialogue, and this is where I feel a little bit optimistic about our future because um, there's something comforting knowing that Jews and Christians fought for a very long time in a very bloody history. And you read those texts, and we kind of reached, I think I would say, especially after the Holocaust, but when we passed, medieval time, and we kind of reached kind of a good time period between Judaism and Christianity, even though we had such bloody history. Which, now when we're dealing with a different inter-religious strife and conflict and polemics, it might take thousands of years, but there's still a hope for even the most fierce debate and argument to find a way to live side by side. Especially if, and this is where my research come into play, where you realize how much the closeness between the religion influence both religions. I deal on the Jewish side of the connection and dialogue of Jews, so you talked about the Bible being the main source between them, but I have to say also even on issues that are not related to Bible, but also related to general theological concept. So every religious person, I'll go back to the Bible, but every religious person thinks about charity, thinks about prayer, thinks about the afterworld, thinks about question like repentance, asceticism, should we suffer for, should we avoid certain things? These are questions that every religious person ever spends their time thinking about. Should we study and not work? What should we spend? Spirituality. These are universal questions that every religious person asks. We tend a lot of the time to focus on the places where the two religion meet to argue. So, for example, like biblical interpretation, but as religious people, we actually meet in a lot of places that we can find common ground or not common ground. So, for example, if I give an example, there's a very famous story in the Talmud about a rabbi who goes into a cave and hides with his son, and he, eats very little. He eats from the carob tree and drink from a fountain of water for 13 years and with his son, and he hides there. And when he comes out of the cave, he runs from the Romans. When he comes out of the cave, has miraculous power and whatever. But he criticized people outside the cave for working the land while he has to work. So this is a very interesting story. This is a very unique story in rabbinic literature. We don't go into caves and the rabbis, they sit in a study house, but who does do cave very, very much at that time period are the Christians, the Christian monks. The monastic movement of the monks started developing in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. This is like the major movement. There's monks all around sitting in caves and in monasteries, and people come to visit them, etc. If you know that, if you understand the background to the creation of that story, you understand that the rabbis are playing around with the question of seclusion and asceticism, and they're using tools that they know from their Christian neighbors, people who do actual stuff like that. And they put words in the mouth. His name is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and they put words in his mouth that are literally taken from Christian text. Why are you spending life of an hour for the life? You're wasting your eternal life for food of the hour. This is an exact parallel to Christian text. Elijah comes around and talks. This is a text that is really taken word from Christian text, but the rabbis are taking that model and playing around with it and asking questions about asceticism. The word Christianity is not even mentioned, but it's obvious that they're dealing with the question not to speak about asceticism from sex, from water, from food, from sleep. These are questions. If you're really committed to the spiritual process that you're going through, would you weaken your corporal body? All of these are questions that are not specific to a specific religion, and the rabbis are playing around with model that they see with the Christian to ask those questions inward. So this is a moment when you say, wait, by the way, this Rashbi becomes the hero of the Zohar, which is a Kabbalistic text, which Madonna now, prompts. This is and that cave that he was in is like a pilgrimage site for more than 1 million pilgrims a year, Jewish pilgrims, and it always warms my heart to think that he was in fact built upon a Christian, monk, but it, completely converted him into Judaism. The question that he asked, and in the centrality of him in later Kabbalistic texts, which is a very good way to talk about the ways religion influence each other and are in dialogue and talk about each other. So this is about the places where religion meet. But if we talk about arguments, Bible is definitely one of the central points of argument. Because it's a shared text, a shared sacred text, which Christians try to use to prove their their superiority, their chosenness, the Jesus, foreshadowing Jesus, etc. And Jews don't, but Jews use it for other things as well. And sometimes the same verse is in the middle of an argument between them. So um, one story talks about the Holy Spirit. Was it created or not created? Now, rabbis have Holy Spirits and Christians have Holy Spirits in their Trinity, and they're asking different questions. And actually, the Talmudic story that talks about it actually have two Christians, two heretics, one who believes in something about the Holy Spirit and the one who doesn't. And the rabbis align with what side of the argument and are very happy when the other guy dies. So they're all celebrating together, the Christian and the Jew, the death of the other one who thinks differently than them. So we actually have awareness. Um, Everything I'm telling you now, by the way, is brand new. We didn't know the Talmud knew the Christian that well to be engaged with them. This is my research. I'm very fortunate to be. This is like 20 years old, brand new. We're all, amazed on how much we can find in the Talmud about engagement with religion, especially Christianity in the Talmud, and in what way it influenced or, had to do with the way the Talmud finally developed. And this is new and exciting because we are not only do we know what they think now, we also know from going backwards, the fact that there is Christian material in the Talmud demonstrate how close the Jews were to their Christian neighbors. And by the way, vice versa as well, because in the church fathers we have quotes of Jews as well. But from the Jewish side, this teaches us that Jews knew Christian stuff, theology, biblical interpretation, praxis, and argued or agreed or were in dialogue or, enough to create those texts that I now read, which is awesome and cool because this is in an area again that you remember the 19th century scholars who said there is nothing of Christianity in the time. Well, there is. We just have to know how to look for it and how to, what are we looking for? And that actually allows us to learn about the history of the two religions.
Do you study Christian texts to uh, understand the Jewish-Christian relationship in the Talmud?
Yeah, I do. I have to because I actually, in my line of work, I put those two texts side by side and I try to see if there's a connection between the two. And I often find them. The cool thing about, and here we go back to Agatha Christie and why I like her so much, is that my work is like detective work. I have parents who are doctors, and they had a hard time understanding my choice of not becoming doctor. And I try to explain why I love my job so much. When I graduated from Yale, you go on the stage with this like, gown and I had my baby twins in my hands and I was very emotional and I get off the stage and my dad looks at me and he says, so you're not going to be a doctor anymore, are you? So it took him that long to realize that this is a real choice that I made. And the way I explained to him and my mom what I do and others is and why it's so much fun and why I chose this profession that I love is that we are mystery solver. We're like the Miss Marple and the Hercule Poirot of the ancient world in that I solve mysteries. I see a text that is completely incomprehensible. We have an argument between a heretic and a rabbi that no one got from medieval time to this time. And me with my, by the way, newly found search engines of scanned text, of Christian text, which didn't exist before, can now find text much more easily and understand what the text is talking about and why is it connected. People had to know all of Christianity in order to understand that. And now I can much more easily do it we have index, I can look by words and I can look by verses. And then look for the connection which are not evident in the text. So it's kind of like a mystery solving thing. But once how you have those when I was growing up, that was very popular. You would have those 3D glasses. You would look at a picture and it would pop out. By the way, I never could do it. Apparently this is a structure of the eye and I don't have it. I don't know how to do it, but apparently it's supposed to pop out, right? So this is a little bit like that. You wear the glasses of Christian interpretation when you read the text, and all of a sudden it looks different, and it's a lot of fun because all of a sudden you understand what the text meant to do, which we kind of lost and didn't know beforehand. So this is a very, very cool work to do and profession. So think about it.
That's really interesting, and I want to ask about the relationship between the rabbis in the Talmud and Christians. Were they somewhat ironic, or maybe they were just involved in polemics and tried to understand each other?
So that's exactly what I was saying. So we thought that they didn't have anything to do with each other, and when they did, it was just making fun of or being polemic or arguing with. My research actually showed that it's not only polemics. A lot of the time it's influence. A lot of the time is thinking together through models, through this, and sometimes even adopting Christian views about certain issues. And that's important to understand as a complex relationship between Jews and Christian. And it was complex. Let me give you an example. So, for example, stories about Jesus in the Talmud. We have a few stories about Jesus in the Talmud. By the way, this is one of the only things that was studied through the 19th century because scholars of historical Jesus, what we call trying to figure out what is historical about Jesus and what is not, were looking for material about Jesus everywhere. So they actually found those stories about Jesus in the Talmud, which, by the way, are not almost not found in printed edition because they were censored out, but we can find them in manuscript, so that's easily done. So this is something that we knew about. It's not something new like some of the other material that I found. So they're trying to discuss Jews and Christian through those texts, right? So what did you? By the way, you can't know anything about historical Jesus from that because these are texts that was found in a text that is the Talmud was redacted in the 6th or 7th century. So, actually thinking that this could have it could have historical kernels in them, but it's redacted so much later. So it's we now think that this is looking for historical Jesus in them is a little bit outdated as a position. But in any case, those Jesus stories, so they're negative about Jesus. There's stories about him, being sexually promiscuous. We have stories about him being mocking the rabbis. We have stories about him in the afterlife, sitting in boiling poop and all kinds of like awful stuff about Jesus. Not nice. There's a reason why it was censored out because Jews were very afraid people were killed for those stories, right? So they were taken out for a reason. But as I teach in class, even if you read those stories and see how negative they are, there's still, first of all, you can see that they knew a lot from New Testament tradition, which is interesting, right? Because it's kind of like stand-up comedian. To mock something, you need to know it. So the stand-up comedian, the woman who, you know, has to take her kids out in the morning and on rainy day and everything like falls apart and this he just this and he forgets this and that. It's funny when she's a mom who went through that, but she tells us from experience. Same thing about the rabbis when they're mocking Jesus they have to know what they're mocking. So they know. So even when you mock Jesus, you show familiarity and of knowledge of Christianity, which is I call it the stand-up rule, right? You have to know to mock. So while you're mocking, I know that you know enough. Second thing is what I call the bus sticker rule. So what's the bus sticker rule? So in Israel, you have in the buses, you have in the front, you have those seats that are facing each other, two and two. And in Israeli buses, there is a sticker that says, "Do not put your feet on the seat in front of you." Now, by the way, I went to Europe. There are no stickers like that, only in Israel. What do we learn from that sticker? We learn two things. First thing we learn is that you shouldn't put your feet in the seat in front of you because it's going to dirty the feet. This is what the bus authorities are telling us. But what's the second thing that we learn from that?
That people do that.
There we go. We also learn the fact that there is a sticker, you learn that people are doing that. So even when, and we actually see that, Christian church fathers are saying, stop eating with the Jews. He's not fasting with the Jews on Yom Kippur. Chrysostom is saying that in the 4th century. He's yelling at his Christian community, stop fasting with the Jews on Yom Kippur. What do we learn? He doesn't want them to fast together, fine. But the second thing we learn that in 4th century Christian communities, people went and fast on Yom Kippur with the Jews. This is an incredibly important, right? Because they're yelling so much. You have people, yelling. You can't be a believer in Jesus and keep the commandments. Why are they yelling that? They're yelling that because people do think that, right? So even when they're doing, so the Jesus stories, if I go back to that as an example, the Jesus stories show familiarity, which is interesting stuff. And lastly, even when they're mocking. So for example, remember my story that what's the worst thing that can happen to you? So I said that the example with Jesus is that you will have a son or a student that will turn bad like Jesus the Nazarene. By the way, the turning bad has a sexual connotation, but whatever, fine. What do we learn from that? Jesus is the worst thing that can happen to you. That's an actual answer, right? That's a very negative portrayal of Jesus. But also, why is it so bad? Because the Talmud still remembers that Jesus once
Was a
was a son or a
yeah.
disciple, right? The Talmud remembers that he was once one of ours. Look at that. Look at the complexity. Even when they're trashing him and making fun of him and talking nastily about him, they still remember that he was once of us. And this is why it hurts so much. They don't say the worst thing that can happen to you is that Jesus is created in the world. No, they say he was one of us and then turned away. And that's the worst thing, right? Your son turned bad. That's why, because and so we remember that Jesus was once of us. So again, when you're asking me, is all things negative about Christianity? My answer comes in layers. The first is no. We have examples such as, Rashbi in his cave, which is a direct Christian influence, and I have other examples as well of Christian, views and theological ideas, etc., which are bought into the Talmud. Second is that even when they do polemics, even when they do trash Jesus, even there you can learn of proximity in two ways. The first is the actual knowledge of Christian New Testament tradition, which shows that they know what they're talking about. And second is that even when they trash him, they always have this, knecht, we say in English, like this like sense of it could have turned out differently. He was once one of ours.
Hmm. That is a very interesting answer, and I wouldn't expect that. So, getting back to the text of Talmud and everything, is there examples of wit or paradoxical thinking in the Talmud? Because there are many Jews and non-Jews agree that there is a specific Jewish humor for Jews, I guess. And are there any examples of wit and paradoxical thinking in the Talmud that would give us people of the 21st century an opportunity to smile?
Okay, so that's the funnest thing about my job. When I teach the stories of the rabbis, I always make my audience laugh. And I always stop in the middle and I say, do you understand? You just laughed from a joke that's like, 1,500 years old. And just so you be aware of it, that this just happened. So everyone, and the rabbis are very funny. Again, not always because they mean to, but a lot of times because they mean to. Um, um, so I'll give two examples. Actually, a few years ago, a magazine, I don't remember the name of the magazine, did like a special issue for Purim with Jews' famous favorite jokes. I was very, impressed by my invitation because I was just next to the guy from Seinfeld and some other comedian, and I was like, okay, that's a nice crowd to be joining and asking about Jewish humor. So the answer I gave there is that we have a series of stories that are meant to be funny about a student who goes too far in taking very seriously the student-rabbi relationship, right? You're supposed to follow your rabbis and do what he does and da 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 da. So we have a series of story about this Rav Kahana who's like, and he's like, so for example, his rabbis go to the toilet and then he finds that his student looks into his stall to see how he wipes his ass while he's going to the bathroom. Now he's like, what are you doing here? And he answers, you're my rabbi, and I want to learn how to do this right. So the Talmud obviously wants us to imagine, look, you're smiling, right? Talmud actually wants us to imagine this ridiculous situation where a guy is with his pants off and he finds that, I always imagine this like stalls in like, in the restaurants when there's like the bottom and the top that you can look at people, right? So you imagine him, the head sticking and he's looking at him and it's supposed to make you laugh because they're taking the question of how far should you go in following your rabbi to an extreme to ask the question, how far should you go? So this is a very good example of the rabbi saying, this concept of rabbi student that we're promoting might meet some limits. Let's check it through a story that takes it to the extreme. By the way, in another story, he goes under the bed of his teacher and he listens in when his teacher, when his rabbi have sex with his wife. So, by the way, the rabbis were very, very concerned about sex and stuff like that, and bodily fluids. This is something that interests them a lot, and so they're pushing it to the end to ask that question, but they're doing it through humor. Right, so doing this is the first example. The second example that I bring is when they're mocking Christianity. So, for example, in one of the stories, this is a real like stand-up comedy about the passion narrative. So, for example, a heretic and a rabbi argue. I remember the story about the Holy Spirit. Then they argue, and then the guy doesn't have an answer, and he says, "You know what? I'll be back in 3 days with an answer." So we wait for him 3 days, and the rabbi then waits for him, and then a second guy comes into the room, and he says, "Good news, bsorot tovot in Hebrew, mevaser tov, and good news. What's the good news? The guy who said he'll be back after 3 days is not coming back. He went up the roof and fell and died." Now, this is a hidden joke because he uses the word in Hebrew, good news or gospel, which is evangelion, which, by the way, never appears anywhere else in the Talmud. This is the only time they use it. And in this context in the story, to say, what's our good news? The guy who is supposed to come back after 3 days and announce he'll come back after 3 days, in fact, is dead. Who said he will be back after 3 days?
Jesus, yes.
Jesus, right? So they're, without saying the word Christianity, never mentioned, but they're saying, oh, that guy who said he'll be back after 3 days, in fact, is dead. And that's our gospel. That's our good news. Now, the word bsorot tovot from the early first century is known to have been the gospel of Jesus saying he'll be back. First for the first coming and the second coming. So everyone knows what this means. So when he comes in and he's like, yay, yay, good news. What's our good news? So see how you're laughing, right? You're smiling. This is a funny joke. And by the way, it's a hidden joke. It's not openly there. You need to know what evangelion means. They needed to know to make the joke. They needed to know that Jesus said he'll be back after 3 days. So look how much information they needed to do in order to create the joke and then, make it happen. And it's a funny, humor. Anyway, so the rabbis use humor to mock Jesus, but also to take issues and look at problematic issues such as, for example, rabbi student, taking the issue to an extreme to discuss the issue itself and using this. So they're using humor often. Sometimes I think they don't mean to, it's not supposed, they don't know they're funny, but they are funny. So yeah.
Thank you. And my next question, I'm also going to start with a Jewish joke. A rabbi, a priest, and a Baptist minister are talking who is the best at what they do. Is it the priest, the minister, or the rabbi? So they decide to separately go into the woods and convert a bear.
A
Whoever is the
bear.
best at, yes, whoever is the best at converting the bear is the best at what they do. So a week later, they ask the priest, how did it go? And he says, well, it was fantastic. I read to him from the Bible, and Sunday morning he was in the front row of my church. Then they ask the minister, how did it go for you? And the minister says, well, it was fantastic. I found a bear in the woods, gave him my morning sermons, took him down to the lake and baptized him. And Saturday morning he was in the front row of my church. And then they look at the rabbi. He is in the body cast from head to toe. So they say, what happened to you? And the rabbi goes, well, I shouldn't have started with the circumcision. And it's an interesting how representatives of different religions communicate in this joke. Because they meet not just once, they communicate, build dialogue. Thirdly, they compete with each other in professional art. And that's an interesting example of interfaith dialogue. Do you think that telling good stories is a tool of interfaith dialogue, creating a space for empathy and understanding to develop and helping to build bridges between people of different faiths?
We have camaraderie happens through humor and through other means, always through history. And we always have to do, and I think the bus sticker rules is a very good example of that. We always have to think of two levels. We have to think of the leadership, and we have to think of the people themselves and what happens on the ground. So you often have the leaderhood trying to separate to religious community. We have laws saying do not accept matzahs from the Jews on Passover, all the way to 6th century. We actually have laws which teaches you the Jews were sending matzahs to Christians on Passover, and laws that says do not persist. If from Elvira, Spain in the 4th century, and from other areas from Turkey and whatever, and we have laws that say do not participate with the Jews on their festival days, and we see that in church laws again and again and again. What do you learn from that? That the leadership wants us to stop, mingling and being friends, and that's dangerous for the community. The leadership wants the religion to be separate and keep, pointing out that separateness is what is needed, as opposed to what's happening on the ground, where people like to be their neighbors, their friends, etc. Now, one of the major issues where you see this, and by the way, I'm going to plug in my new book. I am writing a book that I'm about to finish, which is a popular book about Jews and Christians in the ancient world, and one of the chapters is dedicated to that. And I call it, I talk about the bus sticker rule, and I talk about the stand-up rule, but I also talk about rhetorical moves that you can see this across the board. So, for example, eating and drinking together is something that all ancient religion, by the way, all the way to modern religion, do. They prohibit eating together. Why? Why is it such a big deal? Well, if it's kashrut laws, whatever, a Christian can eat kosher food. It's not about that, right? So why would they not want Jews and Christians to eat together? The answer is very simple. When you eat and your belly is full and you had a good meal and you drank well, whatever, you'll become friends. You'll become, and friends, who knows, they'll have. So this is something that we see across the board. Stop going to their festival. Stop eating with them. Don't eat with them. Paul is saying that to his communities, and don't eat with the Greco-Romans people. And Jews say about Christians and Christians. And in the Talmud we have, what can and can't do with Gentiles and with heretics, and eating and drinking is the first line, right? Kosher wine, it has to be Jewishy wine, because wine is dangerous. If you drink, well, you'll become friends. And we see this very persistent. The people are saying, do not, the leaders of the community, the religious communities keep insisting on separation while people on the ground do different. And food is one of them. Another one is healing. Doctors. If your son is very, very sick and you're very worried, and someone comes along and heals them, and he's from a different religion, that might lead for you to, feel like you want to convert and want to move and or maybe learn something about it. So we actually have both on the Jewish and the Christian side saying that says you should die before you even consider going to someone else to heal you. So we always have to keep what did Judaism and Christianity think about healing by the other religion? Well, let's ask what the leaders said and what people on the ground were saying. What do they think about eating together and drinking together and being married together and celebrating together? Okay, let's ask what the religious, leader was saying and what the people on the ground were actually saying. So we have a testimony from the 4th century of a joint festivity that happened in Hebron area where Jews, Christian, and Greco-Roman were celebrating together in Mamre next to Hebron. And I always read this and I say it's so rare to have, a sacred place shared by everyone in a joint celebration. We do less and less of those through history, medieval time, etc. Everyone, because of religious leaders, go to their own corner. Something about our new modern world where we try to, celebrate and bring all religion into. I love celebrating Christmas with my Christian friends. I always ask to be invited to the decorating of the tree, and I make an effort on my kids to always go to, when we're on sabbatical, to go to mass in the church, and I want my kids to be with, eat Christmas cookies with our friends on Christmas, because I think it's very, very important. And vice versa, we always invite Christian friends to us celebrating the festivity, trying to roll back the prohibitions to do that because of understanding of the social and anthropological background to that. They attempt to separate between religion when we're trying to bring them together.
Definitely. Thank you for that answer. And I think it is very important that interfaith dialogue continues in this positive direction that it might continue right now. And it is great that even though there were some points in history where it was less favored by the people who were the heads of the religious communities, but now it's more favored. So my last sort of a tricky question, if you had an opportunity to ask God one question directly, what would it be?
I don't believe in God. I believe in human that created God. So I don't think I would have asked God anything because I think we created him. I would ask the people who created him, why did they create him as such? I'm always very aware of the fact that God is a very comforting notion. People tend to thank God for good things that happen, but blame themselves for bad things that happen and not God. So you can see, really with your eyes how the concept of God is very it's created for comfort, which I think is a nice thing because it gives you. But I wish that we would use the concept of God to do good in the world. And I'm very, very sad and pessimistic to see the direction that God is taking human society at the moment. So I wouldn't ask God for anything besides, health and good wishes for my family, but and my country. But I would ask the leader of our religious community of the time to use the concept um, responsibly and think ahead of how to do good with that concept rather than bad.
Definitely. I also agree that there were too many wars in the name of God that were unnecessary and were just brought for some political or material gain with no need. So, dear Michal, thank you for the great opportunity to learn from you. Dear friends, thank you for watching my channel. Please react to the podcast, like, repost, all reactions are welcome. See you soon on the podcast, Keeping the Faith.